All right, let's get started. And why don't we start with Nathan today and work up?
This is what I get for suggesting one of the articles. um, so as Venkat mentioned, I had suggested the land before modern APIs. And originally I'd given it a quick scan and it looked promising. And in particular, it seemed, at first blush to complement some of the stuff discussion we'd had around subconscious and noosphere. I think that was a little mistaken, and I think that article falls into some of the same traps that a lot of the articles seem to in Increment, which is that it's very fluffy. It's still an interesting history, and I think it is useful for pointing out how things grow on each other and how there isn't really a single linear thread to development and whatnot. And I think, to get to Venkat's original prompt about the interaction of AIs and humans and whatnot in this, I think what the land before modern APIs kind of points to is the importance of convention. And sort of once things get established, they're very sticky. And it's kind of good to build off of that stickiness as long as it's sufficiently flexible. So, Gordon talked a lot about headers. You can look at the original status codes around FTP and whatnot that then HTTP extended as something else that was sort of sufficiently flexible and yet simple in scope. And I think those are sort of key things. In terms of a good definition of how an API can be extended both humans and AIs, and Venkat may have particular thoughts about this given that the whole Summer of Protocols project. But I think you can think of maybe a protocol as a question of how do you do something, and then an API becomes a subset of that. How do you ask for something? What do you need to say? How do you need to say it? Those sorts of things. So it's kind of thinking of API as a subset of protocol, and you have that all the time between humans. I go somewhere, there's bureaucratic protocols, I need to provide certain documentations. That's kind of essentially a bureaucratic API. If I'm going to ask somebody for help, I need to tell them where I'm going to be and when I need them there. That's the information required in sort of this human communication API. And that's a little bit, and that's kind of independent of, to a certain extent, of concepts of language, not of the concept of language, but of any particular language. There might be different add-ons to that in any particular context, and that needs to be aware of, and that's something both humans and AIs need to be aware of. But the kind of the basics, sort of the who, what, when, where, why kind of thing, which might be the most basic kind of API for communication, are pretty standard, I think, across cultures, at least to the best of my knowledge. So I mostly focused on that one because I had suggested it. I had a chance to scan a little bit of how should we build APIs tomorrow, and found that one a little dated even for 2020. Talking about the need to move to push APIs, and 2020 push APIs were pretty common already. So I'm not really sure where that author was coming from. In terms of customizing responses, I just came off of a project dealing with a lot of GraphQL, and one of the strengths of GraphQL is being able to customize the data you get back. That said, GraphQL is really heavy, and I think one of the problems that we're going to increasingly wrestle with, because bandwidth is a problem, human bandwidth in terms of time, computer bandwidth in terms of networks, all of these are at a premium. So we need to try to be able to question like how can we ask these questions in as short a period of time as possible? How can we minimize that API? And I think a lot of the ideas that seem to be in House shoulders about customization and asynchronous flow are good ones, but modern takes are very, very heavy. So those are just my initial thoughts. I've talked for way too long, so I will pass up to Mayor.
Okay, you didn't talk way too long. That's fine. I looked at eagerly discerning and discerningly eager by Michelle Bou. And first of all, it's a very useful article because it tells you how to think about the API you're developing. And I like that. And just tell you in 2 sentences what it talks about. It says that there's really you can consider the world as containing mainly 2 types of developers. One of them just want to save time. They want to see if an API is any good. Even if it doesn't do exactly what they want, if they can quickly get it up and running and it appears to be good enough, they're going to use it. That's eagerly discerning. The other type is discerningly eager. And what they need is an API which will support them as they continue developing their relationship with the API. And what's important for them is that they can get a grasp, what do they call it, a mental map of the concepts that are exposed and abstracted away by the API. And they're trying to see if the API appears to be good enough for what they have to do later on down the road. Now, what I felt was missing here was perhaps the whole issue is they admit that APIs abstract away the details of the domains because we tend to avoid learning about domains not directly related to the problem we're solving. What they don't really talk about, they definitely, maybe it's beyond the scope of the article, is how do you know what, not the format, but what you should talk about in the domain. And more than that, if somebody actually wanted to learn the domain through your API, what should the API look like? In other words, at the beginning, you're going to start using a small API, and then you're going to use the more sophisticated tools until you really understand the problem domain. So maybe software developers like that don't exist, but in the real world, when we go to a tool like ChatGPT, that's exactly what we're doing. We use it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And yes, we do want to understand what's going on inside and not just whatever limited API we get. And with that, I am passing it on to Jenna.
Thanks, Mayor. I did 2 things. One is on stuff like this, I'm always interested in the web of people that they pulled in to create this journal, this particular issue of the journal. And so just that cast of characters was itself kind of a neat overview. You know, the blind man and the elephant thing, like APIs are so big that they did a good job, it felt like to me in my quick skim, of finding different ways to look at this big gnarly topic. And then my own eye got caught by the how low can you go piece, because of course I'm often trying to figure out how I can do things, because I'm not a coder, and I lurk on the edge of people who really can do it. And so it's always fun to see that if you know what you're doing, the thing can be almost trivial. If you don't know what you're doing, it can be impossible. So what's that space like? And the let me see. All I will say about that is I recently tried to hook up these event recordings that you guys didn't know I'm doing for anything that's on Zoom with Otter and Fireflies. And it seemed like it should be easy and it should be trivial to be able to push those into something that would create beautiful text summaries with some sort of AI thing going on in the background. And then also push the video recording itself into a tool that would create beautiful little video summaries with intelligently selected snippets to help Anuraj with that project. But of course, neither of those things turned out to be trivial or easy. And the one I did, I tried to push Dropbox files automatically through Zapier, and then it was like, oh yeah, no, there's something about Dropbox that Zapier can't have a watched folder that actually works. And then my time and interest and my interest in my interest stays high, but my availability for troubleshooting drops off pretty quickly. So I didn't push beyond that point. And maybe somebody on the call today would like to push at that with me, because that's actually useful. Our ongoing Project Exhaust project, which I like saying out loud, is at the bottom of all this. And then two other pieces. This article, the how low code can you go? Lime Nasri, I'll say her name out loud. No, I may not be doing it right. Mentions JSR 286. So, another whole thing I've never heard of, but the portals and portlet variant of all of this stuff seemed like an interesting, either it was a dead end, or the link that she uses goes to Oracle, which has borked it. But I found a couple of people talking about it, the Edge of Irrelevance article by Eric Spiegelberg. So put that on the someday maybe list. That would be interesting. And then there were three more that really kind of jumped out at me that I would have read today, given more time, was the APIs at scale, where there were actual interviews with people who are out there in the real world using them. And then the Ask an Expert piece, the threat models for API security, that obviously as soon as you open these things up, they've just been a huge vector for all the bad actors. And then maybe the Friday governance call could look at this one, an intro to APIs and e-government. So an actual example, the Nordic Institute for Interoperability Solutions. And, how can APIs work into government? I'm not going to say e-government, because who would say that? So I'll drop those links into the call notes for today, the chat, I mean, and passing it up to Grigori.
I have selected an article, Consider the Interface by Alvaro Videla or Videla. It's basically an interesting look at the problem of API from design perspective. So it contains a whole lot of, I would say, design tropes. And the author tries to apply them to problem of building up an API. It contains actually a whole lot of definitions, including a definition of interface, which was given by Benjamin Bratton, that we have heard about several times in this group. He once was a director of Strelka Institute in Moscow. No longer in. So he defines an interface as a point of contact between two complex systems that governs the conditions of exchange between them. I found this definition very interesting. And then basically author goes on and gives a lot of other definitions. But most of them sound pretty familiar for any person who at least read a little bit about it. And even the sources like Christopher Alexander, his notion of fitness, and Charles Ames and his idea of guest-host relationship are prominently displayed here. So I tried to came up with my own definition of an API, a short one. And they came up with this one. So API is a way to communicate precisely affordances and or intent. So this is what, in my view, an API is. You either communicate affordances, which means limitations, or you communicate intent. And then what I did, I looked at the subchapters of the article, and I kind of checked whether the definition I came up with for API satisfied common sense for all the subchapters. Basically, can it do the job in all the subchapters of this article? And the subchapters are fitness, empathy, evolution, communication, and redesign. And it seems to me that for all of them, a definition I came up with, it allows to communicate fitness because it communicates affordances. It allows for empathy because it gives you an opportunity to communicate intent. The same goes for evolution. Communication is already in the definition, and basically, if your affordances change, you can redesign your API. So does not prevent to do this. So I will repeat the definition. An API is a way to communicate precisely affordances and or intent. And I will pass it on to Anand.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I thought just the general this issue was to start with was I found more articles to be useful than the planning issue, and I quickly read through a few articles. The one, I mean, I read the article that of course that you shared, and I really found it interesting the history of like sort of standards developing and the similarities between the sort of early ARPANET and what's happening today in some of the blockchain ecosystem seems very uncanny. Like the network working group got together and workshopped a bunch of standards. It seems is pretty similar to like sort of how, for example, like a privacy and scaling explorations group in Ethereum working on different standards, which I thought was very interesting. And I also thought the sort of, for example, the error codes that are used and sort of different numerical numbers for categorizing different kinds of errors. It seems like an example of a good design pattern that seems to reoccur in a lot of different software that I've seen and sort of in our own software that I used to work on before. And also, like, you know, things like from the same article, I thought the remote job entry and the sort of whole RFC 360 around it was interesting. And I also found it very interesting that they chose to name name a job as a way to express a program running remotely on another computer or utilizing resources on another computer, which again seems to occur even today for different cloud operations, which again I thought was interesting. While I was reading through this issue and just generally I was thinking it seems APIs are like the kits in the packet punk era, like as to what the Steam kits might have been to the steampunk era in the 18th or late 19th centuries. I thought that was interesting, and I also read this the web API versioning by JJ Gvax, and I thought that article was really nice. And I discovered that he had written a book on API design patterns, which seems pretty good. And there's more I can speak about. But anyway, that's all I had. I'll pass it on to Venkat.
Yeah, this was, I agree with Anand, this was a much better issue than the planning issue we started with. several of the, I did a whole scan of the whole issue very quickly, then dived into 3 of them quickly. But yeah, the whole issue, I think, was both better put together in terms of coverage and asking all the right questions. And then the execution and the answers provided were also, they did more of an actual job addressing the question. Whereas with the planning issue, I felt that though they asked many of the right questions, they basically never got to interesting answers on any of them. So the Darius article on HTTP status codes, yeah, I just felt it was underwhelming, but yeah, it made the main point of like the path dependency of weird little things like status codes, and then it sticks around for a long time, and both substantial parts of such decisions and how you actually structure the architecture, plus subtle parts like what do you call things, and then that name sticks and has a subtle effect for like decades. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I read Anne-Laure Lecun's On the Shoulders of APIs article because it felt like a more social and more modern take, and she's actually contributed to YC. That one was kind of interesting because until it pointed it out, it really didn't strike me the extent to which people are using APIs as sort of labor force multipliers, and it's like a one-man band thing. So things that usually used to take like 5-6 people to do, now a single person working with a bunch of APIs can kind of like rig together and create a much more complex system by themselves. So that was kind of interesting. I read a few of the quotes in the scaling APIs, and that pointed in a few different directions. And I think I read, I forget the title, the same one that Nathan pointed out on the future evolution of APIs. And that one was kind of disappointing because, yeah, it started with SOAP versus REST, which is like a 15-year-old topic that it said some vague things about graph databases and how they have like a slightly different philosophy. And then it made some, maybe I'm mixing 2 articles up, I don't know. But yeah, there was also the article, I think, that talked a little bit about, all right, respect the physics, and you've got like a trip from Australia to the US that's 32,000 kilometers, 100 milliseconds, and how do you design around that? It made a passing reference to Google Keynote, not Keynote, Spanner. And all that struck me as vaguely dated. Like, these are the conversations I was hearing in 2016, 2017. So it's 5 years out of date. But overall, I think the issue kind of did a good job, like creating a map and raising a lot of the right questions. And I think I'm actually going to go back and review more of the articles and do a more complete read, because I think this is what a magazine should do, just to go meta a little bit. It should kind of like provoke curiosity about the whole broad theme and give you just enough sort of perspectives on it that you start to develop a bigger picture view of what's going on. To my own prompt of like how you think about APIs in the age of AIs and metaphors like humans under the API in the labor force. One thought that struck me is a couple of my programmer friends now say that they routinely use ChatGPT as a way to actually read APIs. So I like Grigory's definition that APIs are sort of like not exposing, you said like communicating the affordances of the system. I think I said exposing because I think it's not just communicating the affordances, but making them available to use, of course. So you can actually like turn the knobs. I think AI alters that. So the API exposes its affordances to the AI, and then the AI kind of like translates them into natural language for humans to use. So AI, I think, is becoming an interposer layer between APIs and humans. So that's a thought I'm going to have to sit with for a while. And I think if you apply that logic at larger economic scales, you can think about like, today Uber drivers are under the API and they communicate directly with the app to like get their rides and make money and so forth. In future, I think that'll start to look more like Uber drivers will communicate with like a human-like agent that's actually between the Uber API and their driving experience. And it'll be a bit like, I don't know if you guys watched that old show, Knight Rider, with, what's his name, David Hasselhoff, and he had like a smart AI car that had a personality and talked to him. I think we'll end up with something like that as kind of like the larger social scale thing. But yeah, that's my main comments. And if Anuraj wants to unmute, you can go next.
Yeah, I can talk a bit. So I read that API at scale quickly, and it's basically an interview of the various leadership people at various companies, and they talk about how they think about API. And one common thing that was like kept popping up was how the APIs and documentation go together. And frequently, like by the time APIs are finished, the documentation is like already old, and then they describe some of the tools which generate documentation while they are writing the APIs itself. So that was interesting, and like that also reminded me about one of Alan Kay's talk, in which he talks about how software talk to each other, and then how they are actually quite rigid in how they are implemented. So I implement APIs, but for the metal. So I don't know how the APIs on the web work, but like the APIs in like generally tend to be really rigid, and then there is some sort of flexibility, but still I would call them brittle, and they are like quite easy to break. So like Alan Kay talks about how like software should be able to negotiate the or the protocol with by themselves. I don't know if AI can really help with these, but like that is an interesting like somebody could think about that. Yeah, those were my thoughts.
All right, floor's open, and I'll also remind people of the running prompt of what's the map of this topic like, and what are the gaps that the issue didn't address. Yeah, floor's open.
So not really speaking to the wider prompt, but I do find the historic articles kind of interesting. And I think we tend to, one of the good things about the API history article that I think is sort of pointing out how much the past in computers is still with us, oftentimes in little ways. And it's kind of like all around. There's like little functions if you know where to look at. One of my and little accidents of history. So like one of my favorite stories kind of around this is how text gets rendered in, or at least used to get rendered in Linux and X Windows. If you're using the two big toolkits, Qt, GTK, what they're all doing is they're looking at text, they're rendering it basically as an image, and then calling an API that puts an image to the screen. What's kind of funny is that the original X Windows had an API for putting text to the screen. And Xorg, which is the current implementation that all the Linux systems use that haven't switched to Wayland, like it still has that API. It's carried it around. But for various reasons, I think going to some of that rigidity that Anuraj was sort of hinting at, it turned out that API about like how do you put text to the screen, it made too many assumptions about how do screens work and how do you put things there. And so when it came down to like, well, how do you do anti-aliasing? How do you render text into arbitrary widgets? How do you render text onto arbitrary angles? How do you rotate? It turned out it was just way easier to fall back to essentially a simpler primitive, this question of just a bitmap, and write everything to bitmaps. So it was something that article put me in mind of, was this idea of like simple, flexible primitives, but also this idea of sort of software archaeology, and that in many ways the past is still around with us. I mean, that text rendering API is going to be with us as long as the X Windows system is, which may be forever. So that was just a general thought that I had while reading some of these that didn't really fit into the original conversation.
Just adding on to that, I don't know like how much of this rigidity actually comes from the way we built computers. So if like probably like if we build computers in a different way, like the APIs that are built on top or the software that goes built on top of the actual hardware could be different. Maybe this rigidity is an artifact of the way we build computers at the moment, and maybe with the AI and the computing platform that it will run on might change that.
I was thinking of a mental model for APIs. Like on the one hand, we use the word API to the way we talk. It sounds like the dashboard of a very complicated car, or like control room with lots of knobs and dials and things like that. So it's a view of a domain that's abstracted through kind of like an instrumental interface where there's a sort of underlying physics, and you have to make these judgment calls on how closely do you go to the physics or not, like Nathan just said. But overall, you're basically building sort of an instrument panel mental model of the thing you're working with. But then it struck me that there's also this sense of a structural metaphor. When we say API, it almost feels like a wall or a surface or something, which is why if I say something like blue collar workers are under the API, everybody kind of like immediately gets what I mean. It's like there's already sort of an intuitive structural wall-like aspect. And that, I was wondering what it's like. And then it struck me, it's similar to biology, where you've got, proteins are large, complex geometric surfaces where enzymes work, and DNA is another large, complex molecular surface on which mRNA attaches and then goes to, like, I guess, tRNA and converts into fragments of proteins with amino acids. So there's something very low-level biochemical about APIs. I think they're like active reaction surfaces. So they are simultaneously instrumental and structural. So I'm not quite sure how to think about that or what to do with that thought yet. But it seems like that gets at something fundamental. And it also suggests that there's an answer to questions like, are they necessarily rigid, or can AI make them less rigid? I think actually just going by the biology precedents, APIs are going to remain fundamentally rigid. Like AIs might make them more usable. Like you can ask ChatGPT to read the documentation for you and suggest some sample code to, do something with an API. But that won't remove the fundamental rigidity of the AI, the API itself. It'll just soften the impact on you. It's like tires on metal wheels. The fact that you have tires with air in them that moderates the contact point with the real world surface doesn't change the fact that the wheel itself is metal and has like metal-like properties. So there's something there that I think there's something fundamentally rigid about the API way of exposing the affordances, as Gregory put it, of a system.
Just running with that a little bit, one reason that tires tires help cushion things, and biology is not as necessarily as rigid, even at the level of the cell, as it is at the level of a protein, is because there's lots of different processes going on, and they kind of buffer each other to a certain extent. So I wonder if you could think about it as not necessarily AI even providing an interface to a human sort of interface to an API, but by aggregating different APIs, each of it kind of it becomes a buffer layer. If you can't get your answer, if one set of APIs is failing or is too rigid for a particular set of situations, there may be other sets of APIs, so sort of a substitutability in kind of from an economic sense, but in an API or biological level. And maybe AIs that's sort of a realm that AIs can play.
More thoughts? So if no more thoughts,
Wait,
we'll call it.
Venkatesh,
Yeah.
Venkatesh, I did have one thought. It's malformed though. We're here in the distributed systems, and Grigori talked about an API being, an interface where one system talks to the other one about its intentions and affordances. But what happens to the API when you have a lot of things interacting with each other? I didn't really see that here.
I think the anecdote Jenna mentioned kind of speaks to that, where you're trying to put different APIs together in kind of an open-ended pipelining way, and sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's super hard. I saw you guys on Sunday were like messing around with Zapier email APIs and stuff, right?
Totally no code, yeah.
So I think that, yeah, that's an interesting one. And to extend the biology metaphor, there's a metaphor Darwin used in his original book called The Tangled Bank. That's what your description evokes for me. So he was like writing this poetic passage about the bank of a river with hundreds of species competing with each other. So if you level up from the protein and DNA level of biological metaphor to species on a tangled bank, I think we get what you're talking about.
Yeah, but how does it affect what the APIs look like? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's almost like an evolutionary environment where APIs have to evolve against each other. And you see some of that, like, Apple App Store playing games with apps that run on it and so forth. But yeah, my sense is that we are yet to see like full-blown API versus API competition, but you guys use APIs a lot more than me. So yeah, that's an interesting question. What's the current state of that, how APIs play with each other?
The article that I noted makes it clear that you don't want to make changes in your API. And even when you show it, you don't want to show it differently, because if people think your API is not stable, they're not going to use it. So at least the way we use APIs, the stability is a very important feature. So when you talk about evolution, that's a problem.
Well, but that's kind of like the point of versioning, and I think maybe the difference is, and what we need to become comfortable with is that software developers, I think, tend to have a very, because of what they do is creating a thing, they kind of have a creationist vision of biological evolution. The whole thing was like, if there's people around, why do monkeys still exist? But we don't think of it as like, you've got branches, and just because one thing has split off doesn't mean that the other one goes away. And we always want to sort of shut down the old thing, but the old thing had a niche, and so maybe you think it's, you think about it as the evolution is versioning, but then just because you've got we tend to think of the new version supplants the old version, but maybe that's the wrong way to think about things.
And then you get the tangled web, tangled bank of APIs, and you can never find the one you want to eat.
That's what AI is for.
Yeah, well, now you're saying AI is going to kill the APIs because you can have infinite number of APIs.
I don't think kill. Like maybe that's actually, like, people keep wanting to make search happen with APIs. Maybe, or search happen with AI. Maybe that's like the actual way that AI matters for search, not for like what content is on the web, but literally what API is out there. What API can I eat? today.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of that. And because some APIs are better than others, people talk about them. And then when I find them, I say, yeah, this is exactly the API I need, and it has all the features I need. But the more APIs you have, you get a very, very long tail of APIs, which very few people use. It might be perfect, but how are you going to find them? And who's going to support them?
Well, support is always the question. Suddenly imagining a future of monks, monasteries dedicated to being obscure APIs.
Nathan, I finally watched the movie form of Search for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, and I think the Volgons, if I'm saying it right, those are the guys that will handle that bit for us.
Oh man. And on that note,
Volgans is always a good way to finish a talk.
All right. All right, so we'll pick up on another issue of the magazine in a couple of weeks, and yeah, I think this one worked kind of well. Next week we'll sort of change it up with our usual kind of single read, and then we'll be back to the next issue of the magazine 2 weeks from now. See you guys next week.